Okay, so resuming some comments from chapter 9 then on the significance and innovation. So the last bullet I was mentioning is just a good way to start, is just start drafting out bullets, and I know some of you are doing that, which is great. Again, for me, this always helps me as I think about my writing schedule, if I want to, okay, let me focus in on this section, I'm not spending a whole lot of time sort of regrouping and figuring out where I'm starting again. So let me show you some examples, because I think that this is probably the best way to illustrate a few points. If you can see that okay. So here is an example. So this is the co-parenting intervention. So we just got the summary, we just got our score. So the good thing with this is an R21 that we submitted in June for the first time. It was a co-parenting intervention. And essentially co-parenting is where you try and work with both parents to promote healthy eating within the home, respecting each of their autonomy, individuality, and so on in the home and family dynamics. It got a score, which is great. Yay! I don't think it'll get funded. This is not a fundable score, but that it just essentially says, you know, we will definitely be resubmitting in February. So this is from this proposal. So this is an R21 proposal, and we decided to take the question approach in this case. This is significance. So why target the prevention of childhood obesity in Latino families? And then we say why. Why target dietary calories, fat, and sugar intake? Why test a parent-focused intervention? So these are all making the case for why we want to do this study and the various components. Now, then we go to innovation. We chose not to do the question thing. I'm not sure that that was necessarily a good idea, and we'll see if the reviewers make any comments about it. It's unlikely, because it's not really something that it will impact, but they may make a comment around ease with which you can read it and understand it and so on. Why we chose to do this, I can't even remember. But here you can see more statements, so focus on a novel microsystem. So we're saying, okay, families are important, but actually this is a microsystem that's never been studied before. So while I have information previously on parenting and parenting interventions, so you see that, parents' influence, parenting interventions can improve intake. See the subsections. Flows right nicely into, okay, this is why we want, this is innovative. We're studying a new system within the family system.
Are those the subsections within the significance, does that tie back to each specific game?
It ties. That's a great comment, Antoinette. It ties into aspects of the specific aim. So if you were to do sort of a micro-analysis of my aim and my significance and innovation, you will see that there's a line about something, and then you will see that it relates to something within the significance or the innovation, depending. And that's what Russell Morrison's saying, is trying to make sure that they line up with each other. Do they line up in terms of sequence? No, not necessarily. But there is I could map it. Definitely.
So I noticed, and maybe what she's saying, so if you go back up to B, then you actually put in, so B3, so your third question, and then and then to answer the question, you put B3A, and then you put B3B, just, I guess, to indicate two different responses to this question.
Exactly.
And then, so under significance, you have three questions, so that's why there'd be 1, 2, and 3. It was interesting. It's like,
but it does
an outline format
to
help people follow. Which
help them follow, absolutely.
Following these grants just
and
makes
that
me want to pull my
it does, right? And
They're
so really,
horrible.
and I've seen even better ones of this. Unfortunately, I can't share because I don't have permission to share. But, you know, some people even, like I have done in section B3, do it for all the sections. The problem with an R21 is you don't have a lot of space, right? But it would have been better formatting-wise if I would have had some underlying in response to all the questions, because then that helps the reviewer know exactly where my eyes need to go. They're going to go for anything that's formatted slightly differently.
Yeah, and then it gets back to, sometimes we can overuse
Yes.
bold and underline and italics, and there's so much of it that then you lose your, so finding that right balance.
Finding the right balance and keeping that balance consistent across the proposal too. Don't try and use one approach to emphasize something and then a different approach, because that definitely will not work. But these, especially this section, because I knew this section, B3, was going to be really important for people and lengthier. I wanted to be able to show that, they're important because they influence the behavior, and they're also important because interventions have been done in this area. And although while that might have been maybe more important to include in terms of significance, I kept it at the bottom because it flowed nicely into my innovations.
Well, I see your last sentence talks about it being innovative. Now, is that considered overlap or?
No, that is my transition
Your
sentence. Yep, exactly. I would not have put that in other places. And then I build into, okay, why is this innovative? And then talking about that. And then the only other innovation I had was to focus on fathers, which is slightly different from the co-parenting, because the co-parenting is a very specific model that's been developed, and it's really only been used around like child maltreatment and new mothers, this whole, around this home visitation. There's whole research in this area. Whereas the focus on fathers is not limited to a co-parenting intervention. It's more generally about men and fathers. So that's why we included that there. So that's questions on this example. But Antoinette's comment was slightly different. She was saying in terms of how the specific aims matches or flows into those two sections. We can even look really quickly. It's not formatted the best. So here's the aims. So I start with talking about the families, most important socialization agent, family systems, parents. We know a lot about moms, we don't know a lot about dads, family intervention being important, and so then talking about the co-parenting. So there are pieces of that that will then flow, or that are elaborated upon, is probably the best way of saying it, within the significance of innovation. Okay, so let me show you another example.
Can I ask a kind of unrelated question?
Yeah, of course.
So that was a R21, which is
Mhm.
6 pages.
6 pages.
But then that was page 48.
That was the entire proposal that was submitted. So that, this is the whole thing.
All the bios, all the stuff goes before
Everything.
that.
So when you
Oh.
submit a proposal, this is the entire package that you're going to get. So I just went down to the aims and then the research strategy. Now you can see here, so let's look at how well this adheres to the guidelines too. So the guidelines say that the significance and innovation sections each should be about a half page to about 3/4 of a page. So you can see here that my significance is maybe a little bit more than half a page, and my innovation section is probably about a half a page, maybe a little bit more. But that pretty fits the guidelines pretty well. Now here is, let's see, this one. This was an R01. This was in response to a very specific request, but it still had the same sections, significance and innovation. There was just a few other sections before that they required in this announcement. That's why it's labeled D as opposed to B. They had you respond to other things. Here we decided not to use the question, where it was just the importance of studying diet for cancer, the habitual behavior of food shopping, child influence on food shopping. So you see how I'm sort of going broad to narrow, getting very specific. And then, the Latino customer and the gaps we intend to fill. So that's how we chose to do it with this one. And then innovation, so here, very brief, right? We're using eye tracking, we're including men, we're looking at different, we should have said maybe different store types or something like that. And then Latino versus non-Latino whites, and then intervention development approach. So those for us were all of our innovations.
Intervention development approach as an innovation.
How we're going about doing it, yeah, exactly. Yep. So we can talk more about what makes it something innovative or not. We'll come back to that. Okay. So, and questions for now? We can definitely go back to the examples here in a minute. Okay, so there are the two sections, so B and C generally, unless you have another type of proposal. We already talked about length, a half to 3/4 of a page is typical for an R21. It can be longer for an R01. So I would say for my R01s, significance and innovations can be up to a page and a half. Okay, so what are they looking for? The positive effect that successful completion of your research project is likely to result as a result of solving an important NIH relevant problem. Innovation, a new and substantially different way of considering or addressing an important public health relevant problem that results in substantive departure from status quo, thereby enabling new horizons that are pertinent to NIH. One of the ways in which I know we've gotten positive reviews on innovation is when we can think about how our innovation has the potential to generalize to other diseases, other disease models, other health behaviors. Because then it says something about the potential for your making contributions that are beyond, much beyond this project. And that could, things like, recruiting participants into a study that may normally be hard to reach. That's an innovation. If you have a new way of doing this, even if it's involving a partnership, but you have a new way of partnering to get those kind of outcomes, that would be considered innovative. Okay, so getting to significance. So these are some questions that you'll ask or a reviewer could ask. Does a project address an important problem or a critical barrier to progress in the field? So for me, it's logical for me to start with obesity, diabetes, whatever the disease issue is. That's usually among the first paragraphs you're going to have in the significance section. The next one, if the aims of the project are achieved, how will scientific knowledge, technical capacity, or clinical practice be improved? So here is looking at, okay, where is this research going to go, especially if it's more in the developmental phase. So where am I going to take this research after this study is over? And it could lead to more research. That's perfectly reasonable, especially with an R21. And then finally, how will successful completion of the aim change the concepts, methods, technologies, treatment, services of preventive interventions that drive the field, or rehabilitative services, whatever they might be. Okay, so those are the things you want to be asking yourself. So this is where I deviate a little bit from Russell and Morrison, and I'm curious to know if anybody else sort of saw the benefit of using this approach. I still get to all of these, I just don't put it in the parts in the way they describe them. So part one is a critical analysis of the literature, gaps in the field, concluded with a description of contributions. So for me, and maybe it's just the type of research I do, I have contributions in many different areas. So you saw that before. It's not only just developing different types of family interventions, but a contribution also is involving men in this research. Maybe promoting healthy eating in a different way with the restaurant-based intervention. I'm not just trying to educate people on what's healthy, I'm actually trying to change the environment. So there's a lot of ways that this research can be significant. And so that's why maybe this part thing doesn't work for me. And it may be, I wish Sharon were here to give me her perspective on this, is, maybe it just fits a different type of research paradigm that is more consistent with what they describe in the approach section. I don't know. Anybody have any reactions to it based on what they read or what I'm saying here or what they're reading? No disagreement so far? Okay, so then, so that's the first part. The second part is statement of significance. So simple, direct statement of what you expect to contribute. That is definitely in there, and in there multiple places. What I do, and we can go back to that paragraph in the gaps, that could encompass all of those things. That's one reason why we often put that paragraph as sort of a summary paragraph to say, okay, here are all the things that we know, why this is significant. If we put all this significance in sort of one big bundle, this is sort of what we're delivering in terms of meeting that significance. So that's why we have that sort of summary statement, depending on the complexity of the intervention. And so this to me would be the most critical piece, because you're saying how are you addressing this? And then part 3 are other benefits to the scientific field or other improvements that we could potentially see. I see this as less relevant. There's so much other stuff to include. I'm not even going to go. I'll show you those examples in a minute. Okay, so innovation. Does the application challenge or seek to shift current research or clinical practice paradigm by using novel theoretical concepts, approaches, methodologies, instrumentation, interventions? Are these novel to one field or novel in the broader sense? So that's important to make that distinction. Again, because if it's broader beyond, broader beyond that field, that's a good thing from an NIH perspective. And then finally, are there any refinements, improvements, or new application of theoretical concepts, approaches, methodologies, and so on? This gets more, especially when you're getting around dissemination or translation type research, that last one becomes more important, but it's not limited in terms of what you might be doing. Again, they say that there are 3 parts. Again, I'm not sure that I necessarily use this approach, but I do address all these comments. So what do we know now? What's the norm? What's the new way of doing it? Description of how your project is innovative. Preliminary data is essential. It does not go in here. It goes in your preliminary study section. And then really, how are you advancing that we wouldn't be able to do this without this funding? So really thinking about, again, moving that field forward, not just incrementally, but major changes in how we do things. Okay, so your proposal can be innovative. This was from an old study that I was involved in a few years back. So it could be innovative from a methodological perspective, from a theoretical perspective. So here are a couple of examples. The proposed invention will be the first to target sedentary dog owners as a means of increasing physical activity in the general population. Very clear. This is a new way that we're going to try and promote physical activity. If you can make that statement, that's awesome. In, obviously substituting the content areas. Another novel aspect is to use or involve veterinarians to deliver physical activity advice to humans. That's another really innovative. These things are what make it exciting. It's like, okay, we have a problem with obesity. We have a problem with people being sedentary. Let's try something new, right? And you're going to get a much more favorable response, at least from an innovation perspective, when you do something like this, than you would be to do, say, another group-based exercise intervention that everybody's done. And so, even if it was in a new population, it wouldn't be as interesting. Or it could also be theoretical. Finally, having a dog trainer available to ensure dogs behave while being walked on a leash will make dog walking more pleasant for owners. This is an innovative intervention component. So what this is, and this then tied into the evaluation and all the mediation analyses, is to say this is what we're hypothesizing, and so we're going to test this mediational model to say this is the process by which people are being more physically active. So it's now adding not necessarily a new theory, but maybe the way certain theoretical concepts are operationalized and how we're putting together to inform an intervention. Make sense? Okay. We'll go back to that. So organization and content, these are really critical. We've talked about some of them already, but because it's such a short section, especially in an R21 and even in an R1, when I think about sitting down, when we wrote the parenting intervention, I'm like, oh my gosh, there's so much research on family-based interventions. How am I even going to touch this? So I didn't really address as much as we wanted, and that might be one of the critiques we have. Put this in the better context of what we already know about family-based interventions. I think we touched on it very lightly, so it might be something, I'm assuming it will be something we'll have to add I think of this section and each of those separate subheadings are these like a little mini lit reviews. This is the way I approach them, and yet, you know, it's like, okay, how do I say what I need to say in just a couple of sentences? But I really treat it that way when I'm writing it. And what I mean by that is I really digest the literature and say, okay, what do I know about this? And it's very much the phrase, if I had time, I would be brief. I mean, it's sort of like, how do you condense all this into a small amount of space and make it meaningful? One way is, again, going broad to narrow, so you're really using the funnel approach so that you're making an argument for your proposal. Briefly, you could summarize each section, each subsection, like I mentioned. So how is this filling a gap? How is this innovative? The nice thing about those sections is they're often what reviewers pull from when they're preparing their reviews. So if you provide them language that they can easily use, they will actually use it and say, this project is innovative, and you could see it. And some people even say, quoted from the proposal, which is perfectly fine to include in the review. Okay, that's that. I mentioned this already in terms of subheadings, so I'm just curious, how many of you would be more inclined to use the question approach at this point? Raise your hand. Antoinette, if it fits. Okay. Okay. How about you guys? Would you use more the statement? Would you use a complete statement? Would you just use single word, 2 words?
Probably more complete statements for me.
Complete statements. Good. Have you seen good examples of that, Nicole?
Yeah, that's what Heather uses in a lot of her grants, and that's
Got
what
it.
Melissa's used in her grants too.
Okay.
So.
Great. Yeah, what do you think?
I would use like phrases
Mm-hmm.
that states what the topic is.
Got it. Okay. So closer to maybe a full sentence, but maybe not a full grammatically, complete sentence. Yeah. So that's the best thing to do, really. I think anything that's more complete, like if I had to go back and change that one study where I said just eye tracking, I probably would have made it more complete. It was probably more of a space issue than anything else. But it would have helped the reviewers, I think, read it. Numbering and lettering of subsections. I've talked about this a little bit before, and it really gets more relevant when you think about having to revise. And so remember when I said that your introduction to the application, if you're doing if you're revising it and resubmitting it for possible funding, as we will be doing, a lot easier if you can say see section D3, for additional details on how we, modify this or something. So. And we've talked a little bit about referencing. I have a couple other things in referencing here. We talked about this before, as we tend to use the numbers as opposed to APA, and it's really more of a space issue. But as a reminder, if you want to acknowledge somebody who's made major contributions in the field, you can still do that by citing their work. Just say it in a different way, say Brown et al. Did this, as opposed to having to use the citation, because it is impossible. Now, I include this in here because you definitely want to include data, especially in your significance section. So here's one thing that I've seen on proposals that have not been well received, that don't get funded, don't get scored, is that 2 things happen. One is they don't include any data, so a person reading it has no idea of how bad a problem this is. And you'd be surprised, well, why wouldn't you include that? I have no idea. But the other issue we see is it's not current, right? And so that's one of the things that they really emphasized a lot, I think, in this chapter more than the other ones. And partly because people often reuse text, right? And so, and that's normal. But if you're presenting epi data, in particular, any sort of prevalence, incidence data, whatever it might be, make sure it's current. Because you need to show that you've kept on top of the literature, that your research is not, you're not basing it on data that might be 2, 3, 5, 10 years old. Same thing, so make sure that you stay current. The second part of this, special note which letter fit, I've mentioned this a little bit before. This is more of a nuanced thing related to R21s and shorter proposals, and just think about where information needs to go. So it doesn't always, the theoretical and methodological support for the intervention could go in the approach section, specifically in the intervention section, but it may also go somewhere in the significance section too. So it really depends on where you're trying to provide that support. Does that make sense? In terms of where you would include stuff? Questions on that? Okay. Do use, obtain, read, cite primary sources. You can use review articles, but actually some grant books, for some reason, they discourage them. Maybe they see it as a way for your circumventing really to understand the field in depth. I don't know. Anyway, so, and don't use secondary sources, don't use reports as much as possible. It's not that these are not allowed, you just are not showing as good of an understanding of the field when you're not using primary sources. Here are some things that you want to keep at a minimum. So you want to keep at a minimum in-press articles, unpublished proceedings. We already talked a little bit about that before. Personal communication. I remember having 2 proposals that had, I stopped counting the number of personal communications, and I'm like, why would you even think that that was an appropriate source? But the other ones are websites. And I've mentioned before that there are some reviewers, I'm not one of them, who will actually check all those website resources, who will actually go and read your papers, even the ones that you might not have included in an appendix, let's say, because maybe they have concern about your understanding about a particular methodology. So don't assume, if you include it in there, it's possible that some reviewers will take the time to actually go and look for them and make sure. If they're not up to date, if they're not working, then that's actually a huge disadvantage, because that is one of those things that if it is called to the attention of the entire study section, you could just see the energy and the enthusiasm for that proposal start to slowly go down, and then people start looking for other problems. So it's a nuance here that you've got to, that's not unimportant, and yet you think it's really not that big a deal. So be careful. I don't really use them hardly at all, in part because we don't have control over those websites sometimes. So it's better, I'd rather find a primary source that I know that they can find most easily. Yes, Antoinette?
The in-press articles is just because the reviewer can't access the article?
Exactly. So what they recommend is if you have an in-press article and it's super critical, assuming it's not publicly available online, include it in the appendix or some portion of it. Yeah. Yeah.
I think I asked you this before,
Yeah.
but in terms of articles that have been accepted,
Yes.
is that okay to include?
You can include a description of the information within the narrative. You probably want to put it in the preliminary studies. You can include it as an appendix, assuming it's not publicly available already. So one of the things that both Mingan and I have experienced is a paper that's available online and considered in press, but it's not published in the journal for like 2 years. Like the Journal of Physical Activity and Health is notorious for this. It takes years for it to actually get into print with the way you normally think about it, but it's available. It's definitely available. So I would say if you haven't gotten to that stage but it's accepted, you can definitely put it, and I would put it in the appendix if it's critical. Yep. Other questions? Okay. So overall, you want to make sure that your ideas fit into a larger context, that they advance the field, scientifically sound, but also innovative, testable, and obviously feasible and matches with your funding mechanism, which is probably the hardest thing to do. So now I want to turn it over to you, and I want you to tell me a few things about how you think your research might be significant or innovative. And if you want to just take a few minutes to jot a few ideas down, and then we can go back and look at some of the examples that you want. There's lots more.